of the study, based on the CNBC Indonesia report, the COVID-19 pandemic has affected all business lines, especially the oil and gas sector. This pandemic also has an impact on the weakening of investment in the oil and gas sector in 2020. Based on data from the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources Indonesia, investment in the oil and gas sector until October 2020 has only reached $8.1 billion or only about 59% of the 2020 target, which amounted to $13.8 billion. Also, based on the CNBC Indonesia report, Indonesia has a target of oil production of 1 million barrels per day and gas of 12 billion standard cubic feet per day in 2030. The investment value need to achieve this target is $187 billion or around 2,711 trillion. Although it requires an investment of thousands of trillions, in fact, the attractiveness of oil and gas investment in Indonesia is still below Malaysia. Based on data from Wood magazine in 2020, countries that have high investment attractiveness in the upstream oil and gas sector include the United Kingdom, United States, Australia, and Norway. In Southeast Asia, the attractiveness of upstream oil and gas investment in Malaysia is even higher than Indonesia. Therefore, it is clear that there are significant comparisons between Malaysia and Indonesia in terms of oil and gas investment.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Mohamad Farid bin Mustaffa. My matric number is 261949. Today I would like to present about the objective in our project. Okay, now we go to the research objective in our report. We have three objectives. First, we want to identify foreign direct investment (FDI) in the oil and gas under the mining sector in Malaysia. Second, we want to identify the FDI in the oil and gas under the mining sector in Indonesia. Third, we want to identify the comparison between Malaysia and Indonesia in the oil and gas sector based on the FDI.
FDI in Malaysia based on the Malaysian Foreign Direct Investment Statistic Report for 2020 by the Department of Statistics Malaysia, DOSM. Foreign direct investment in Malaysia recorded a net inflow of 14.6 billion ringgit in 2020 compared to 32.4 billion ringgit in the previous year, a decline of 54.8%, partly as a result of global economic uncertainty caused by the pandemic COVID-19 situation. The decline in FDI flows was due to lower equity and stock investment fund as well as higher lending to overseas affiliates. In terms of position, FDI increased to 698.8 billion ringgit at the end of 2020. Meanwhile, investment income decreased to 44.6 billion from 60.5 billion ringgit in 2019. FDI for oil and gas mining sector. For the oil and gas sector, to look at this sector in FDI, the mining sector can be seen to identify the contribution of the sector in FDI in Malaysia. This is because mining involves the extraction of non-renewable resource and this includes oil and gas. Based on the figure, for FDI in 2019, the flow for the mining and quarrying sector is 5.1 billion ringgit, which accounts for 60.0% of the total FDI flow in 2019, amounting to 31.7 billion ringgit. Meanwhile, for FDI in 2020, the flow for the mining and quarrying sector is 2.0 billion, which accounts for about 13.6% of the total FDI flow in 2020, amounting to 14.6 billion. There was a drop in flows for this sector of 3.1 billion ringgit. Its contribution to overall FDI flows also fell from 16.0% in 2019 to 13.6% in 2020, a drop of 2.4%. Meanwhile, FDI income also fell for the mining and quarrying sector. This is because in 2019, FDI income for this sector is 5.0 billion ringgit. However, in 2020, FDI income for this sector will fall to negative 0.7 billion ringgit. The decline in FDI flows and income for the mining and quarrying sector, which includes the oil and gas sector and FDI as a whole in Malaysia in 2020, is influenced by several factors. Next, factors. First, tax rates. In Malaysia, the standard rate is 24%. However, at 70%, lower rate for small and medium enterprises is practiced. Several countries in Asia and Europe have lower tax rates than Malaysia of 20%, namely Hong Kong at 16.5%, Singapore 17%, and UK 19%. The abolition of GST and raising the country's dependence on petroleum revenues at a time when world oil prices have fallen have hampered efforts to lower corporate tax rates so that Malaysia is more competitive with neighboring countries. And second is transport and infrastructure. The enforcement of several phases of the Movement Control Order (MCO) in 2020 has hampered several economic activities, including some growth factors of the mining sector, such as the transportation phase in this sector, which has resulted in poor performance of natural gas and crude oil in 2020. Third is size of economy, with Malaysia GDP shrinking 17.1% from a marginal growth of 0.7% in the first quarter of 2020, and the 2020 quarter performance being the lowest GDP growth recorded since the fourth quarter of 1998, which is negative 11.2%. This proves why every sector experienced a decline and FDI fell in 2020. And the last one is political stability. Political, economic stability, and corruption-free governance and bureaucracy give confidence to foreign investors. This is evidenced by the investment by Saudi Arabia oil company, Saudi Aramco, amounting to $7 billion in the refinery and petrochemical integrated development project in Pangerang, Johor in 2017, where in 2017 there was no political crisis and the government was in stable condition. As in 2020, it can be seen that Malaysia has experienced a political crisis at the end of February, which has led to a change of government. Not to end there, throughout the year 2020 until now, this political crisis is still ongoing, which the government seems to be in a state of instability as a result of the behavior of politicians, which this situation has caused foreign investors are not confident to invest and look for other countries.
Okay, now we go to the FDI in Indonesia. As you know, FDI in Indonesia is the capital movement in the current fiscal are referred to the foreign direct investment. This is because the total of the equity capital, profit, revenue and other capitals. Okay, direct investment is the type of the corresponding investment in which a person from the one country has control over the sensitive amount of influence over the management of a company in other country. Okay, now based on the graph, we can see that Indonesia foreign direct investment have decreased by $80.0 in billion in 2020 compared with $25.0 billion in 2019. If we can see that this is a decreased trend in 2020. This is because the COVID-19 affect the FDI in Indonesia. Now we can examine FDI in the oil and gas industry in Indonesia by looking at the mining inquiry sector. This is because of the oil and industry is a part of the mining inquiry industry. Exploration survey of oil and gas in extraction in Indonesia for the convenient methods, namely making geological observation and dismantling oil with cement. Example of the service activity connected to the oil and gas mining that are carried out on the basis of free oil contracts. Based on the graph, we can see that in 2020, the foreign direct investment in mining inquiry sector in Indonesia is 6.4%. It shows decrease from previous year is 7.6% in 2019. The decrease in FDI in Indonesia for the mining inquiry sector, which include the oil and gas sector, and FDI in Malaysia is influenced by several factors. Okay, the factor influencing the FDI in Indonesia is one is the tax rates. Okay, oil and gas industry in Indonesia we exposed to many level of tax. We have a corporate income tax is 25%. We have a taxable income tax, and we have a base earning tax is about 20%. Okay, the apply to fund attractive oil and gas from Indonesia. For a turn of corporate income tax for oil and gas company operation in Indonesia emphasize the important into output for exploration and the production and distribution. So the other supporting operation strategy for both inbound and outbound business activity as well as vice versa. Okay, the corporate tax rate has reduced to 22% for 2020 compared to the previous year in 2019 is 25% for tax rate. The second factor is transport and infrastructure. Okay, in Indonesia, the government regulation number 30 of 2019 and the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources has said that gas business to pipe regular gas transportation by pipeline in Indonesia. Okay, in Indonesia also have a BPH gas organized access to oil and natural gas transportation by an associated infrastructure by relying on the MEMR's transportation master plans. The third factor is size of economic opportunity of coal. Indonesia has the largest economy in South Asia with a gross domestic product GDP in 2019 is 1,120 US dollar billion. In year 2020, economic growth in Indonesia we slightly lower than the previous year at 159 US billion. The Indonesian oil and gas market contribute to the region's oil production that account of 5% of the global output. The region's energy market are currently undergoing a change that include petroleum product specification criteria based on region's environment legislation. Okay, according the IMF, the budget deficit is increased from 2.2% of GDP in 2019 to 4.7% in 2020. This issue the trend is increasing in 2020. Okay, the next factor is political stability. The political climate in Indonesia has shifted dramatically in recent years. Joko Widodo, the president of the Indonesia, present his plan for handle economic reform by expanding the nation infrastructure, helping the ministry sector change the FDI regulation of foreigner and digital the economy. The oil and gas law give the government sole right to oil and gas exploitation and any private firm interest in employ for and using oil and gas resources to sign collaboration. The specific working group of upgrade oil and natural business activity for SKK Migas with success the now defined implement body of oil and natural gas business activity. BP Migas relevant government authority in such partnership. Okay, the oil and gas sector in Indonesia is primarily governed by Law Number 22 of 2001, the on oil and gas, natural gas, the oil and gas law. Okay, that's all for me about the FDI in Indonesia. Now I will pass to the next presenter.
FDI, foreign direct investment, is the process whereby residents of one country, the source country, acquire ownership of assets for the purpose of controlling the production, distribution and other activities of a firm in another country, which is the host country. Mining, oil and gas is one of the contributors towards nation's FDI growth in terms of economic. So, mining companies are generally in the business of obtaining naturally existing solid minerals like coal and ores. Oil and gas is the process of extraction liquids, which is petroleum. So, in Malaysia, Indonesia, the mining is diverse. So, for the size, Malaysia is 6 times smaller than Indonesia, with the population of 32.7 million people live. But then there are 234.4 million more people lives in Indonesia. As for the comparison on year 2019, the Malaysia FDI was 8.04 billion USD compared to Indonesia with 25 billion USD. On the following year, due to pandemic COVID-19, the effect it implicates both countries with the decrement of FDI. So, for Malaysia, the FDI on 2020 was 3.57 billion USD, which signifies 54.8% of decrement, while Indonesia, the FDI was 18 billion USD on that year with a decrement of 28%. So this clearly shows that Malaysia suffered more losses compared to Indonesia in terms of the FDI. So going more specific to the main factor, which is the mining of oil and gas. For Malaysia, in 2018, the flow for the mining and quarrying sector is 5.1 billion, which accounts for 16% of the total FDI flow in 2018, amounting 31.7 billion, and which is equivalent to 1.24 billion USD. Meanwhile, for 2020, the flow for mining and quarrying sector is 2 billion, which accounts for 13.6% of total FDI flow for 2020, amounting 14.6 billion, which accounts for 0.5 billion USD. While in Indonesia, the FDI was 2 billion on 2018, which is 6.4% and lesser than previous year, which is 2.25 billion USD, which is 7.6%. So both of the country face a downfall due to the pandemic outbreak effect. A tax rate is the percentage of a person's or company income that is taxed. As per Petronas Malaysia, the oil and gas company in Malaysia, each year of assessment, a chargeable person's income earned for petroleum operation is subject to a petroleum income tax. So the current rate for petroleum income tax is 38%. So in Malaysia, it's 38%. Meanwhile, in Indonesia, the corporate tax is normally steady at 25%, but in 2020, it is 22%. However, there are some exceptions for resident businesses. For the oil and gas industry in Indonesia, they were levied 30 to 45% of income tax rate. Infrastructure is a broad phrase that refers to a company, region, or country's core physical systems. There are systems. These systems are critically important to a country's economic growth and success. In Malaysia, to regulate a pipe gas supply and utilization operation, the government passed the Gas Supply Act 1993, Act 501, and the Gas Supply Regulations on 1997. The most important goal is to safeguard the interests of customers and publics who are exposed to it. Meanwhile, in Indonesia, the government regulation number 36 of 2004 regarding upstream oil and natural gas business activities, as amended by the government, regulation number 30 of 2009, and Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources MEMR, regulation number 19 of 2009 regarding natural gas business through pipelines, regulates gas transportation by pipeline in Indonesia. On next to the size of economy, FDI is frequently aimed at directly selling item to the country that is attracting the investment. So with Malaysia's GDP shrinking from 17.1% from marginal growth of 0.7% in the first quarter of 2020, and the 2020 quarter performance being the lowest GDP growth recorded since the fourth quarter of 1998, which is negative 11.2%. This proves why FDI fell in 2020. The Indonesian oil and gas market contributes to the region's oil production that accounts for 5% of global output. According to International Monetary Fund (IMF), the budget deficit rose from 2.2% of GDP in 2019 to 4.7% in 2020. Both countries was heavily affected, but clearly Malaysia suffered more. In Malaysia, political, economic stability and corruption-free governance and bureaucracy give confidence to foreign investors. This is evidenced by the investment of Saudi Arabian oil company, which is Saudi Aramco, amounting to US 7 billion, which is 31 ringgit Malaysia billion, in the refinery and petrochemical integrated development project in Pangerang, Johor, in 2017, where that time there was no political crisis and the government was in stable condition. Political and economic instability has made investors less interested and fear of loss of invested assets. So the Petroleum Development Act of 1974 and the Gas Supply Act of 1993 are the key laws govern Malaysians oil and gas industry. On Act 501, the Petroleum Development Act of 1974 regulates the oil and gas industry. All actions in the value chain are covered by the Act, except for the gas provision through pipes to Singapore. So Malaysia has a thriving oil and gas industry. The Gas Supply Act of 1993 regulates the gas supply to consumers. So meanwhile, in Indonesia, the oil and gas law gives the government sole right to oil and gas exploitation, and it compels any private firms interested in exploring for and using the oil and gas resources to sign collaborations. The oil and gas sector in Indonesia is primarily governed by Law Number 22 of 2001 on oil and natural gas, the Oil and Gas Law. The conclusion, mining, oil and gas is one of the contributors to a nation's FDI growth in terms of economic. The mining, oil and gas, extraction industries of Malaysia and Indonesia is diverse. Indonesia is 6 times larger than Malaysia based on the CNBC Indonesian report. The COVID-19 pandemic has affected all business lines, especially the oil and gas sector. There were significant changes to foreign direct investment, FDI, in Malaysia and Indonesia on year 2019 and 2020. In Malaysia 2019, the flow for the mining and quarrying sector is 5.1 billion, which accounts for 16.0% of the total FDI flow, amounting to 1.24 USD billion. Meanwhile, for 2020, the flow is 2 billion, which accounts for 13.6% of the total FDI flow, which accounts for 0.5 billion USD, while in Indonesia, the FDI for mining in 2019 was 2 billion, which is 6.4% and lesser than previous year, which is 2.25 billion, which is 7.6%. So both face a heavy impact from this pandemic. So few factors were taken into consideration, which is political stability, size of economy, tax rates, and also economic growth. So Malaysians and Indonesia FDI were both heavily affected, but as we all can see, the Malaysian suffered more.